Morning world, it's the 31st of December 2019, it's about 11 a.m. UK time. In about 1 hour's time the new year starts, the new decade starts on the other side of the world from me, and then it's going to spread around the world in one 24-hour revolution of the planet on its axis. I'm not going to be sentimental and look back over the last year or the last decade in any maudlin terms. But this last decade has seen the emergence of the internet and social media, along with the global refugee crisis and a growing sense of injustice, and especially amongst the young people, what they see as the abuse of privilege by the so-called elite. As I speak, there are people on the streets in the Czech Republic, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Colombia and Ecuador, in Chile, in Sudan, in the UK. The new Prime Minister with his mistress and his top political advisor are off on a Caribbean island on holiday with a newspaper editor and a few Russian oligarchs. The Australian Prime Minister has been fiddling his thumbs and playing his flute like Nero in Hawaii whilst his country burns. When I see the footage just this morning of people on boats going out to sea to avoid the fires where their whole country is burning, and yet they still mine coal and poo-poo climate change. I'm not even going to get started on America. I don't want to get trolled any more than I already have been. Russia is in the grip of not so much the oligarchs as the dictatorship. And it seems that especially in this last 1 year, there's been an ever-growing sense of connected protest worldwide. And that is not to say that the youth are all talking to each other and organising a collective process, but they are talking to each other and organising protests independently of each other, but with each other's help. And much of the protest has been peaceful. Some of it has not. But one of the trends of 2019 has been a growing sense of disenchantment with the way that the so-called leaders and the so-called governments are running the shop and actually lining their own purses as opposed to looking after the people they purport to represent. And as we get into 2020, the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in January is going to raise the ante on this. It's going to escalate things. And with many of my clients, I've been saying, yes, by the time you get to the end of January, the hardest time of 2020 is over. So if I relate that to the world, then yes, we're heading into a pretty sticky time, one of the stickiest times I've ever seen. Unlike anything else. When I was really young, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. I've seen the fall of the Berlin Wall and the alleged downfall of communism. And the rise instead of gangster politics in various shapes and forms and disguises in many different countries of the world. Sounds really depressing, doesn't it? Two positive outlooks though. Firstly, the future. Once we're past January of next year, we then emerge into a year of having Jupiter conjunct Pluto and Jupiter sextile Neptune, both of which I see as really positive aspects when it comes to breaking down and reorganising systems of governance, whether it's individually, collectively or nationally or globally. And long term, of course, we have the wonderful, what I consider the wonderful Saturn-Neptune conjunction coming up at the very end of Pisces and the very start of Aries in about 4 or 5 years' time. That is going to change the world permanently and bring a sense of collective responsibility into the world big time, and not a moment too soon. But I'm an astrologer. I've worked out in recent years that astrology is not an it, it's a she. That astrology doesn't, people don't find astrology, astrology finds people. Astrology found me in the late 70s. It's finding more and more people all the time. I'm going to be doing a lot of teaching from March onwards, but I've got some big changes planned for the way I put astrology out into the world from the start of March. But more on that one another time. People's awareness of astrology, people's knowledge of astrology, and people's working with astrology over the last 2 or 3 years has become more pronounced than at any time in the last 500 years. Astrology is now in a completely different game from any other form of divinatory art, whether it be tarot reading, tea leaf reading, palm reading, channeling, mediumship. Astrology is now in a class of its own, and it is surging. And we're going to see steadily over the next 2 or 3 years more and more people taking it seriously. Not because it's about fortune telling, because it's not. As I say to my regular clients, I'm a misfortune teller, not a fortune teller. I'll tell them what they don't want to hear a lot of the time, but then the intelligent ones go away and work with it and use it and actually improve their lives with it. Instead, astrology is becoming the new lingua franca for the consciousness revolution that's developing. More and more people are saying enough now. We don't need people to tell us what to believe, how to pray, how to have our relationship with the divine. And it seems that the idea of the old systems of collective order are drawing to a close. Hopefully in a way that can be done peacefully without too much bloodshed. I noticed that in Lebanon, in Chile and in Iraq, all of the protests of recent times have been really peaceful, involving children, women, weddings, parties, until the authorities clamp down on them, in which case people start dying in their hundreds. I'm not advocating revolution or anarchy. I am advocating social change. And it's going to happen. There's nothing that anyone can do to stop this now. Social change across the world is going to happen. The old systems of religion, governance, and the political orders of the past have become redundant, and we're seeing an end to them. This is going to happen. It is just a question of whether we go with it willingly or kicking and screaming. What I know from dealing with people of my own age and older is that as we get older, we become more resistant to change, in the majority, not in all cases. And yet change is the one factor that's going to accelerate evolution and push us forward along the evolutionary level, at least at the consciousness and spiritual level, hopefully still at the material level. But when I see the planet, when I see the almost sub-zero temperatures in Delhi, where it's having its coldest period now in India that it's had for well over 100 years, and yet still you still can't see the next street because the pollution is so bad. When I see Australia under a blood red sky, when I see the deforestation that's going on around the world, I kind of wonder, how much longer we as humans have got left. And particularly when I see the so-called ruling elite blindly ignoring all of this because it doesn't make money to deal with it, I find myself becoming ever more contemptuous of the people who allegedly represent me. I have to pin my hopes on the youth. I have children, grandchildren, and I can only hope that they use astrology with this, because astrology gives us a frame of reference that is independent of any form of political or religious dogma or thought. It places the responsibility for personal evolution directly on the individual. It makes you responsible for your life, and it makes you responsible for the way you deal with your life, the way you deal with things like anger and rage, as well as love and passion. At the end of the day, there's one planet, 7.5 billion different worlds, and we are all responsible for our own perception. As we move into the 2020s, we're entering probably the most complicated time of human history. But one of the things about the long term of astrology is that it does give us a long-term perspective. And it's clear to me that within 4 or 5 years now, the pattern will be set for the very long-term future. So by the time I'm 70, 71, which will be around 2025, 2026, then we're going to be able to make plans for the long term with relative confidence. But let's get there. And first of all, let's get to the end of January. Have a great party over the next 24 hours, folks. Don't let off too many fireworks. The world's polluted enough. And but in the meantime, just turn around to your neighbours and your family and just smile at people, because what you've got to lose. And a smile goes a long way, more than fireworks and more than social media. Have a good one, folks. Catch you next decade. Bye. Oh, sun sign videos for the new year will be up within 2 hours of now. Bye now.